Many in our world today make science their God, but then turn a blind eye when it comes to the scientific reality behind when life begins.
Many pro-life advocates claim that life begins at conception.
Human life begins at conception.
From conception, this is when life begins.
Life begins at conception scientifically.
What's more, many of them claim that this is an objective scientific fact.
Science has proven
it is an objective,
basic science
that human life begins at the moment of conception.
In this video, I'd like to unpack how much truth there really is to that claim. And to do that, we'll break down some of the most common reasons used to justify why the moment of conception is so special. The argument that comes up the most frequently is that conception is the moment at which a genetically unique individual is formed, distinct from either of its parents. This distinguishes the zygote, the cell formed after conception, from the egg or the sperm. There are a few problems with this argument. The first is that conception is not the point at which the two parents' genomes are fused into a single one. At the moment of conception, the two genomes are still separate, and it takes another 15 hours for the two genomes to even migrate close to each other. Only about 24 hours after conception do the respective chromosomes start to mix. This poses a problem for the life beginning at conception view, because if genome fusion is the standard, then there is a period of time following conception where the embryo is not really an individual yet. Putting this aside for the moment, there is a deeper problem with the claim that unique genome equals unique individual. Take a look at identical twins. Clearly twins are two distinct individuals. I don't think anyone would claim that we only have one person here. But at least one of them was not formed as the result of the fusion of two genomes. Instead, the embryo simply split in two, yielding two cells with identical DNA that can each go on to develop into adults. What this means is that creating a unique genome isn't necessary to form a new individual. Ben Shapiro gives a different reason for why we should see the zygote as special.
It is instantiated at conception because, again, you will be a fully conscious creature given an appropriate period of time as long as you're not killed.
Others have likened the process of development to the shaking of a polaroid, and that once conception has occurred, the fate of the zygote becomes distinct and a human adult is all but guaranteed.
So you excitedly point your camera in that direction and snap a photo when the card comes out. So imagine you begin excitedly shaking the little card, and as you're doing that, someone else who's nearby grabs the card from you to have a look at the picture. But all they see are those black marks, and they think the photo didn't properly take. And the person responds to you and says, "It was just black marks. Why do you care so much about black marks?" You would likely reply, "It wasn't just black marks. Everything about the image was captured in an instant. It just needed time to develop."
In either case, since fate is already determined, we should make an equivalence between the zygote and an adult right from the beginning. To back this up, there is often an appeal to genetics, saying that the zygote has all the information necessary to encode a full organism encoded in its genes.
When a seed of a man joins the egg of a woman, a new unique set of 46 chromosomes are formed, and that's when life begins. This new creation is unique and has all the parts necessary to form a human being.
The idea that genes can fully determine an organism is pretty widespread and is far from being restricted to just the abortion debate. Today, many people mistakenly talk of organisms as computers who simply run the computer code given by DNA. The problem with this computer or Polaroid metaphor is twofold. First, the DNA is far from just computer code. It certainly does not have all the information needed to produce an organism. A developing embryo needs plenty of support from more than just DNA. It needs the right nutrients through the umbilical cord, the right maternal signals, and has to make it through the grueling process of childbirth. And even after that, it has to be raised and cared for to become an adult. This is all information that is not provided by DNA alone. I don't know any parenting manual that says, "Oh, don't worry about it, it's all taken care of by DNA." So no, DNA doesn't provide everything an embryo needs to produce an adult organism. Second, speaking of development as a Polaroid does a gross disservice to the reality of pregnancy. It's estimated that between 40 and 60% of embryos fail to implant into the womb. Implantation is a necessary step for embryos to develop into fetuses, so none of these will end up becoming adult organisms. On top of that, 13.5% of pregnancies end in miscarriage, for reasons often outside the parent's control. so these embryos will also not become adults. Many babies die during childbirth for various complications. Many babies die young because of all sorts of diseases. None of these humans will become adults. So no, development and raising kids is not like a Polaroid at all, yielding a
fully conscious creature
by default. A slightly stronger argument along these lines admits that, yeah, we do need to provide the zygote with the right environment, the right food, and enough time in order to get a fully mature organism.
Something is an organism if you can give it the right nutrients, the right environment, and time. If you can give it those three things and it goes from being an immature member of a species to a mature member of a species, then it's an organism.
This still runs into problems because, well, what exactly do you mean by environment? By all means, if I give the egg an environment with a lot of sperm and then put it into the womb of a healthy surrogate, then yeah, I can totally get a baby. That's how IVF works. So does that mean that the egg is a whole organism? Or why not go further back? If I lock a guy and a girl who like each other in a bedroom with some nice candles and enough food and water to last for 9 months, then it's totally possible that I could get a baby by the end of the 9 months. So does that mean that this whole setup is a whole organism? All I did was give
The right nutrients, the right environment, and time.
I imagine a common response at this point would be,
If you don't draw the line at conception, then where's the line?
or something like, yes, okay, sure, development is complex and nothing is guaranteed, but conception is just the clearest point at which we move from two individuals to a single one. So it must be the beginning of life. That is, every distinct human has their own boundary. Everything contained within their skin is a part of them. That boundary first began at conception and gets maintained all the way through development and adulthood until you die. Nothing before conception can count as an organism because this special boundary hasn't been created yet. So conception must be the beginning at which we get a new individual. If this is the argument, then it also has serious problems. Where exactly do you draw the line between organism and environment? Do you count all the gut bacteria living inside of you? And when exactly does the food you eat stop being a part of your environment and become a part of you? Do you count prosthetic legs or prosthetic arms as a part of you?
And what about viruses who insert their genomes into ours? At what point exactly do they become a part of us? What about congenital twins? Are they two individuals or one?
This brings us to an important point. The answer to when a new organism begins isn't one that we can observe. No amount of observation or empirical data will help us to answer the question. It is a philosophical problem. It is a question that asks us to define what we mean by organism, life, and individual.
Why should boundary formation or genome fusion be the start of a new individual? The onus is entirely on you to justify why either of these or any other should be the standard for the creation of a new organism.
You can certainly argue for one concept over another, but these arguments aren't going to be based on experimental data. They're going to be based on philosophical justifications. No lab can ever tell us when we ought to consider one moment of the human life cycle the beginning. Nature, quite frankly, doesn't care when one individual begins or ends. It just keeps chugging along no matter what we humans think. So no, the statement, life begins at conception, isn't an objective scientific fact. It is a subjective philosophical position that is certainly up for debate. So what do I think? Well, the question of when does life begin is actually pretty easy. Life on Earth began around 3.5 billion years ago, maybe in some nice little hydrothermal vent. Ever since then, life has been doing all sorts of things, evolving into endless forms most beautiful. Sometimes life managed to organize itself into clearly repeating cycles, which we happen to call organisms. What we are trying to do here is work out when along this cycle is the beginning. But just like Dr. Banks has to work out in Arrival, there is no beginning and there is no end. It's a circle. Is the embryo alive? Well, yes, of course, but so are the sperm and the egg, and I don't see many people trying to defend the lives of sperm. The question of when life begins is not really the question at the heart of this debate. Rather, it is when does a new organism begin? And that is a much harder question to answer because organisms are processes, and trying to fit them into boxes with nice labels for organism 1, organism 2, and organism 3 is simply not going to work. At least, not definitively. You're always going to have overflow in the blurry world of processes that we live in. And yes, there are clearer cases than others, but it's never going to be 100% discrete. Distinct, isolated individuals don't exist on Earth. So where does all of that leave us? Well, even if we can't clearly answer the question of when a new human organism begins, this doesn't actually have a huge implication on the ethical side of the debate. To see why the two questions of when does life begin and are abortions moral are not directly chained to one another, I highly recommend watching Abigail's video on PhilosophyTube here. Sometimes there are some very good questions that science cannot answer. Sometimes scientists and those appealing to its authority simply have to put experiments and data aside and sink back into the armchair to do some philosophy.